It's a task most managers dread, giving feedback to an aggressive employee. Unfortunately, when aggression is left unchecked, it continues. So HR managers and practitioners need to respond quickly. Today, Eleanor Shakiba explains how to do this. Eleanor, the scenario you've built into this program I think is a fascinating one, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about it. So tell us more about what happened in this particular situation.
So this was a situation where I was running a team building session, and one of the team members just casually mentioned, so what happened next was Frank threw his computer out the window, and I said, hang on, just stop. What actually happened about Frank throwing the computer out the window? And there's sort of this silence, and then people went, well, nothing, we bought him a new computer. So it became really obvious that Frank's aggression was being unchallenged, and that he had a passive manager who was not doing anything about the fact that his behaviour was escalating beyond just being aggressive. It was now becoming violent.
Right. So what signs, I guess, show that a manager is avoiding this feedback? I think you said it's sort of taking a very passive role, just avoiding actually confronting the situation.
So often the team member will have a reputation as being a difficult personality or moody, and so the team themselves are using those labels, and that's obvious in that case that the manager is aware of it, but they're not doing anything about it. The team will also be complaining amongst themselves, how come Frank gets to carry on like that and nothing happens about it? So you'll actually hear the team talking about it and suggesting that something needs to be done. So that's the first set of signs. The second one is quite classic for HR practitioners. The manager comes to the HR department and says, you got to do something about Frank, he's a real problem. And you sit down and you talk to the manager, and it turns out that for the last 2 years, Frank's behaviour has been escalating, and the manager has done nothing about it, and now he wants to give the problem to you.
Right. And I'm sure this is a very common issue that a lot of HR people face. So let's dig in. How can you prepare managers to give feedback to these difficult people who often have a fearsome reputation? How can you prepare them to actually confront and deliver some pretty difficult messages?
So the first thing to do is actually to educate them around how the fear reaction will kick in during the conversation. So to educate them around the fight, flight or spite reaction, and to point out to them that the staff member is actually being driven by stress or fear and they're going into fight mode, but that's triggering a reaction in the manager and they're going into flight mode and they're avoiding handling the situation. So first we want to give them an understanding of what's happening to them. Then we want to teach the manager how to handle their own flight reaction. And technically that's called emotional regulation, helping them to learn to handle the fight or flight reaction, to be able to calm themselves down and to be able to calm the other person down so that the conversation can be had. And then there comes down to the pragmatic point of needing to have phrases to use to open the conversation. So having some model phrases like, I'd like to talk to you about some behaviours that I've been noticing lately. Or I noticed yesterday that when you were talking to Sarah, your voice was very loud and I just want to talk to you about what impression that might be making. So actually having some lead lines that you can start the conversation with.
Now, in terms of talking about those lead lines, what function do they fulfill?
So what they're doing is they're first of all framing the conversation as being a feedback conversation. But secondly, they are focusing attention on behaviours rather than personality. So you're going to avoid things like, I notice you're very aggressive lately. What's going on? Wow, if you want to trigger someone's fight reaction, that's probably a good way to start. So you want to avoid labels or generalizations, and you want to really be clear about what you heard or what you saw the other person doing. Because if you can say, I saw you or I heard you, you are inevitably going to be focusing on behaviour.
Now, you've talked about fight, flight. What about spite? Because you did mention that before. What's the difference between fight and spite?
Spite is passive aggression. Spite is deliberately undermining or sabotaging, but doing it in a covert way so that you can't be held accountable. So some classic examples would be sarcasm, or accidentally on purpose making mistakes, so your manager will never ask you to do that sort of task again. Or making nasty jokes, and then when other people say, I don't really like that sort of joke, saying, what's wrong with you? You're too sensitive. Throwing the blame back on the other person.
On the other person. So, summing up, what would be an immediate action plan for a manager who is anticipating that they need to give feedback to someone who has one of these reputations for being aggressive?
Mm-hmm. So grab a copy of Difficult People Made Easy and get some of the model phrases that I've put in there, and then modify them and make them work so they sound like it's you speaking, and so that they fit your cultural organisational context. And then create an action plan. Write down where you want the conversation to end up and how you're going to lead the conversation to get there. And also, maybe if you're really concerned that the other person will get quite aggressive, plan out how you're going to manage the situation if it escalates, how you're going to set up the room so that you can get out of the room if you need to, but also how you can set up the room so the other person doesn't feel like you've backed them into a corner.
Well, I think there's, again, some very practical tips there for dealing with what's quite a frightening situation for some people. It's a really tough situation to face. And I'm looking forward to working with you next month.
See you next month.